welcome into the show. Last week we started out talking about, or actually just 2 weeks ago, we started out talking about how things are going here in our area after the flooding from Hurricane Helene. People have been working tirelessly to clear the way, to start to clean up and start to rebuild. The community and the surrounding regions have really come together. It's been amazing to see them gather supplies and support the cleanup efforts and just take care of displaced people. It has been absolutely amazing. The damage in areas that are near the mountains and in the mountains is crazy. We have had teams from Texas. We've had teams from Bethel University in Indiana helping us out. We've had supplies flown in from Alabama. We've had supplies brought down in trailers from Kentucky. We've had people ship stuff through Amazon from all over the place. And so we are so thankful. I will tell you, the needs are going to be going on for a long, long time in this area. There are literally towns that are just wiped out. And so there's so much rebuilding that needs to happen. And so you can continue to pray for that. And if you want to know how you can help watching from somewhere else, feel free to contact me and I will get you connected to the right people. Now, in the middle of all of that, we still have an election coming up in less than a month now, and I've talked about some of the things that I feel like are at stake in this election. I'm going to be honest with you. I think free speech is on the ballot in this election. I think unfettered abortion is on the ballot in this election. I think that fair elections are on the ballot. Obviously, I think the safety and security of the country is on the ballot. I think mutilation of confused kids is on the ballot. But there's also something that is figuratively on the ballot that no one is talking about, but it's becoming more and more apparent. And that is the Constitution is on the ballot. We've kind of reached that point. And I know there's always all this hysteria and everybody kind of says, if it doesn't go our way, we're going to lose the country and that kind of thing. But I see this, and it may seem like overkill for me to say that. However, if you've been paying attention, you see that more and more public voices are questioning if the Constitution needs to be replaced. Now, here's the thing. For years, one particular party has been working against the Constitution. They've been willing to break the system to stay in power, right? But they've been busy calling everything the other party does as unconstitutional or against our democracy. So it's always been weird because it feels like they don't actually like the Constitution, but they talk a lot about how important it is. But now the mask is just off. Mainstream groups are openly saying the Constitution needs to go. There have been articles in places like the New York Times that just say that. There have been attempts to pass legislation or to govern in ways that are just flat out unconstitutional. Like, hey, we're just going to do this, and it doesn't really matter if the Constitution's okay with it or not. And so I think there are many reasons for that. First of all, the Constitution was put into place to limit not what the people can do, but it was put in place to limit what the government can do. And that is very inconvenient for career politicians, right? I mean, you think about it, like no matter which side of the aisle you're on, and I think, you hear words like uniparty, it kind of feels like it at times, right? And so if you're in power, unlimited free speech is a problem, right? Because people can talk about what a bad job you're doing. And if you can get the news media to kind of cover for you, then you've got social media over here that is letting people say what they want to say, and so then that needs to be cracked down on, right? And so and that's exactly why the founders felt like things like free speech were so important, is because you should be able to be held accountable for how you're doing. Second, this is just another aspect of a move towards Marxism in our culture. If you're not paying attention to Marxism, then you're missing it. Marxism loves to tear down structure and replace it with chaos. Critical theory teaches that power structures are set up to benefit those who were in power, those who set up the structures, right? For that reason, the Constitution has been accused of being racist. Like, since slavery was in place when the Constitution was written, and since the founders did not abolish it right away in order to get that unity of all the states and get buy-in from everybody, they say that everything about our nation, including the Constitution, was founded on racism and needs to be destroyed. Some people are concerned that the Constitution just doesn't fit our current culture because it was written for a culture that was 250 years ago. And the case is made that the founders could not have foreseen a lot of the issues that we face today. However, some of the issues that we face today are a sign that we have gotten away from common sense and moral values. So instead of adapting our government documents to fit this new set of values, we need to return to those values. An example would be same-sex marriage. In the majority opinion on Obergefell, the Obergefell case, Justice Kennedy wrote this. He said, "The generations that wrote and ratified the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment did not presume to know the extent of freedom in all of its dimensions, and so they entrusted to future generations a charter protecting the right of all persons to enjoy liberty as we learn its meaning. When new insight reveals discord between the Constitution's central protections and a received legal stricture, a claim to liberty must be addressed." So he basically said that we can make the Constitution say anything we want it to say as long as we feel like the founders did not understand or foresee something that we're facing today. He's basically writing a new constitution. They like to call it a living constitution, right? So we don't look at what it originally meant and what it said, and then we apply that to a situation that we have today. We can say, well, they didn't fully understand that, so the Constitution has to adapt. And so basically they're just writing what they think should happen. Basically writing a new constitution to suit how he feels about things. But we don't need to write a new constitution. The Constitution, frankly, has a process whereby we can update the things that might not have been foreseen. There are ways to amend it, and it is an arduous process, and most of the nation, so to speak, would kind of have to agree on that through our members of Congress and through state legislatures. And it's good that process makes it hard to pass an amendment. A lot of people don't see it that way, but it's something that we're all agreeing to live by. So it shouldn't be that every 4 years the party in charge can change all the rules. That should not happen. Right now, for instance, Ron DeSantis is proposing a couple of amendments that would be amazing if they could get passed. It would be hard to get them passed, but he would like to see term limits for Congress. Imagine what that would do if you couldn't camp yourself out in Congress and get paid for your influence for year after year after year. But basically, I've got 2 terms, and in my 2 terms, I need to get something good done for the country because I'm not going to be here. Like, I need to get something done and move on. And the goal is not just to continue to keep power. The goal is to get something done. I think that would be amazing. He would like to see a balanced budget amendment. I mean, man, how common sense is that, right? So those are just some of the examples of things that have been proposed recently that could possibly be amendments. But again, it's a long process. I think one of the greatest reasons that we're hearing so much complaining about living under the Constitution in 2024 is that it's based on a worldview that people no longer want to acknowledge. America wasn't founded to be a Christian nation, as in it's expected and forced that everybody would act Christian, be Christian, that kind of thing. But it was founded on Christian principles. And you can't detach those things. Christian principles run through the way everything was set up. So now people who would like to get away from those principles, in many cases, they would like to get away from those principles so that they can silence Christians, or they can declare what we believe to be hate speech, not realizing that in the process, they would create a dangerous precedent where government decides what views and speech it will accept or enforce. That's a scary world, but people don't realize what they're asking for, right? They just would like Christians to be quiet. And so, of course, they try to use separation of church and state, which, by the way, is not in the Constitution. It's another example of when the Supreme Court actually just kind of rewrote the Constitution on its own. So here's what I want to do. First of all, I want to give you a few ways that the Constitution is heavily influenced by a biblical worldview. And then I want to talk about why replacing the Constitution would probably be a disaster. Okay, so and when I say the Constitution is heavily influenced by a biblical worldview or by the Bible, here are some examples. First of all, the Constitution is designed around the idea of the sinful nature of mankind. The reason for the checks and balances between the branches of government is because they understood that apart from the work of God in our lives, humans cannot be trusted. The Constitution would be it's going to be our mutual agreement, right? So within that framework, the executive branch can execute, right? The legislative branch can pass laws. The Supreme Court can be brought in to decide if the other two branches are functioning within the Constitution. The president can veto laws from Congress. The Congress can override those vetoes through enough votes. No one is just railroading through their agenda without questioning if it's constitutional, because nobody has all the power. And the reason they set it up that way is because they understood we are sinful, and anybody with that much power is probably just going to be self-serving. The founders knew that too much unchecked power in the hands of one person or one group could get out of control. And so they also wanted a lot of things left up to states and communities, because they understood the idea of accountability, right? There's way more accountability in local areas than there are in some faraway capital somewhere. And they understood that if you pass something that benefits just you and not the people that you represent, they understood it's way harder to do that when you have to look your neighbors in the eyes, right? And so we've lost some of that because the federal government controls so much now. And it's been proposed, for instance, that the Department of Education be eliminated. And a lot of people are angry over that. And teachers especially. It's so interesting. Teachers who are really conservative get really upset when they hear something like that, the Department of Education being done away with. And so what's interesting, people get upset about that, but our educational performance since the Department of Education was created in 1979 has continued to slip. We've gone from a leader in education to barely in the top 25 in science and reading, and well outside the top 25 in math. So, it's not exactly working, right? It seems that federalizing the education system took away that local accountability. And some governors have attempted to structure their budget to where they no longer need to take federal money for their schools. And again, a lot of people just think that's absolutely crazy, but honestly, it could be the best thing in the world to not be being told by the federal government what you have to do a good job. Because what we're actually saying is we trust the people who are on the boots on the ground educating kids. We trust them to make good decisions to educate our kids. We don't trust bureaucrats. And so, that may be part of the problem, but a lot of people see it as a money issue. Like they get so upset over we're talking about dropping our federal funding. Like that's money that we need to educate our kids. But that has been the problem for years in many areas, right? We have just thrown money at issues, but we aren't asking how effectively is the money being used. In many cases, the money can only be used for federal mandates that have been handed down. So it's stuff that maybe you wouldn't even want to do anyhow if you got to run things how you wanted to run things. And so that's just one example of how the founders wanted many things to be handled at the state and local level instead of a federal level. Now, there's another huge issue that we need to talk about when it comes to the founders building in these checks and balances on power, because they had this biblical worldview, this biblical view of human nature. And as I referenced earlier, Marxists say that when people are in power, they set up systems only to benefit themselves. Therefore, those systems need to be torn down, they say. And of course, they propose an unrealistic worldview that says that there should be some collectivist system of rule. Now, that always sounds nice, but frankly, somebody still has to be in control. And that's going to mean that somebody is in complete control, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's why you've never seen that work anywhere in history. Have you seen it? Everybody always says, well, it hasn't been done right yet. Come on. Is that a risk you're willing to take when you look at the millions and millions of people that have died in those scenarios? But it also lends itself to mob rule and just constant upheaval. And so the word that they use for this is hegemony. But think about what the founders were reacting to when they established this country. Just think about that for a second. They were coming off being ruled by one of the most hegemonic systems there could be, right? Had been ruled by a king who set things up to benefit himself and benefit his fellow nobles. You had no way to advance your station in life if you were a common man. You really didn't have any say. You didn't have free speech. You didn't have freedom of religion. So naturally, they set up a system where the common man is represented, where he chooses who will represent him, but they also set it up so that larger states can't control and force all other states to do what they want. And they did this through two really important means, the Electoral College and through the Senate. And so in the House of Representatives, states get representation based on their population, right? And so larger states have more influence. But in the Senate, every state has 2 representatives. They have the same amount of representatives. And in the Electoral College, it ensures that larger states, they do get more electoral votes, but it keeps a few large population centers from making all the decisions in presidential elections. And so they put so many checks in place to make sure that no one can become too powerful and that the common man would have rights no matter what state he lived in and would be represented. And some people complain that in the beginning, not everyone had all the rights that they should have had. And I get that. There was a huge problem in our American culture, right? But because of how they set up the Constitution, when those decisions were evaluated, the founders basically left us no choice but to do the right thing, which is awesome. Did that process take longer than it should? Absolutely. But think about this. Can we come up with a more fair system? Can we come up with a system that ensures freedom for all? That's the question that we need to ask when we talk flippantly about, maybe we just need to do away with the Constitution. And so, some of what we're hearing from our culture today is that they would like to see, when you think about people saying, "Oh, let's get rid of the Constitution," you're hearing proposals like we would like to see discrimination against some people to make up for past discrimination. So we're going to set up our country based on intentionally discriminating, which would actually be worse than how we founded things, because we literally started by saying all men are created equal. So we at least declared the right thing. We weren't living the right thing. We were at least declaring the right thing. We weren't saying we want to be about discrimination. We are seeing people like that propose that we should control what some people say if we don't like it. We have a vice presidential candidate right now that keeps saying that free speech is not guaranteed if it's misinformation, which who gets to decide if it's misinformation? And how often lately have we heard the media and politicians say, well, that's misinformation, and 6 months later it turns out to be true. So you're going to get thrown in jail, you're going to get your social media canceled, all those kind of things for a judgment call that somebody else is going to make when they have an agenda. And it could turn out 6 months later that you were actually right. There's discussion about packing the Supreme Court. And so those who worry about a hegemonic system should pay attention. If one party is willing to break the system and set up everything the way they want it, you will definitely have a hegemonic system at that point. And you might like it at first, right? Because you feel like that you like seeing certain people censored, and they seem to agree with you on who should be censored. You may want the Supreme Court to decide things in a certain way, so you may like how they set up their hegemonic system. But eventually you will see that the founders' biblical wisdom in avoiding letting anyone have absolute power was really, really wise. And in letting the general public hold the people that represent them accountable, that it was really, really wise. And so we've already done a podcast on free speech. It's biblical. I really feel like it is. Freedom of worship is obviously biblical in the sense that we should be free to worship God, and the state should not infringe on what the Bible tells us to do. And God never forces anyone to follow him. So honestly, he would want us to be able to share the truth with people who disagree with us, but he would also allow them to make different choices than what how he wants to be worshipped for now. Eventually, every knee will bow, right? And so the founders understood these things from a biblical perspective. They understood that everyone is made in the image of God. And of course, they understood that man is inherently sinful as well, which we've talked about. Again, the podcast is called Spiritual Reality. Why? Because what God says about how things work is reality. And we can work against that. We can hope that things will work differently, but they just don't. because this is God's world. So, is the Constitution perfect? No. Should we worship it? No, of course not. But of course, there is a process for amending it. It's a tough process because we better think long and hard before we change the thing that we all agree to live under. Right? I mean, we should think long and hard about that. Some Christians may act like the Constitution is equal to the Bible, and that's a mistake. That's not right. But marveling at the wisdom that our founders had in creating it is not a bad thing. Understanding that it was designed for people who adhere to Christian ethics is not Christian nationalism. It's important to understand that. Just understanding that our country was set up for people with Christian ethics. That's not Christian nationalism to say that. So in my opinion, the Constitution is still relevant to our world in 2024. It deals mostly with big ideas about how government should be set up and our basic rights. I don't think we can do much better. I definitely think that when you listen to the people who would like it replaced, they do not intend to replace it with something that ensures freedoms for all, that limits the power of government or treats everyone equally. Like, you just listen to what they're saying, and that is not what they want. And so it's scary to think about, like, let's just scrap it, right? Again, our hope is not in the Constitution, but still, we have to make wise decisions. And I get why the argument that our nation had some dark days in the past, and there were some dark things even in our founding, that would cause somebody to think, well, maybe we just need to get rid of the Constitution. I understand that thinking. I think it's a little simplistic. I don't think it's really looking at a deeper level at what's going on. But before we do that, we should possibly evaluate if it wasn't actually the principles of the Constitution that brought us out of those days in the first place. If it wasn't the fact that the Constitution says that all men are created equal, like if it wasn't for those things, if it wasn't for the rights that it grants our citizens, like if it wasn't for the way that it was written in the first place, that maybe that's what brought us out of those things before we go and scrap it. And so that's all the time I have today. Thanks for listening. Remember, God defines reality, and you would do well to live in it. We'll see you next week.